Thanks for tuning in. You're watching Arirang's Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Daeun. The world braced for an impact as tensions mounted in the Middle East, but Israel's apparent retaliation and Iran's reaction both remained rather muted, hinting at de-escalation in the region, at least for now. Meanwhile, U.S.-China tensions are only intensifying as the Biden administration moves to triple China tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, with China's alleged involvement in America's fentanyl crisis quickly becoming another source of friction, further exacerbating the strain between the two nations. Heightened Middle East risks and U.S.-China tensions. That's the topic of our discussion today. And for some insights, we connect to Ban Kil Joo, research professor at the Ilmin International Relations Institute of Korea University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. Pleased to join you.
We also have VOA correspondent Jessica Stone joining us from Washington, D.C. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
Professor Pan, I want to start with you. Iran played down the apparent Israeli airstrikes, saying they were more like children's toys. Israel is yet to claim responsibility, but Iran hasn't yet acknowledged Israeli involvement either. What's your analysis of the airstrikes and Iran's reaction? Can we say that the two countries have averted the worst case outcome?
Well, they seem to have done. It is not usual that an attacker is reluctant to claim responsibility and a defender tries to play down its attacks, particularly in a situation where both are state actors, not one state actor. Based on what has happened so far, both Iran and Israel seem to remain restrained in order to stay away from the worst case scenario, which is a full-scale war. Why do they do it? First, both countries were not seriously damaged by a series of military responses, attacks and counterattacks. I would say that a little damage is not accidental, but intentional. Each of the two countries did not want their attacks to cause serious damage to the other so that they would be able to stay away from a full-scale war. Second, both countries do not openly talk about these attacks that have already been made, but one about the next possible attacks. The reason why Iran said Israeli attacks were like children's toys is that it wanted to say that it is willing to tolerate these attacks, which means Iran would not make another counterattack for this. Simply speaking, both countries do not want a full-scale war. If then, why did these two countries make attacks in a situation where they did not want a war? Their military response is designed to show the domestic audience that its military is strong enough to respond to the enemy, leading the audience to feel secure. In addition, each country wanted to show the international society and its enemy that it intended to make deterrence function by doing something against the other's military action. In this sense, both countries are most likely to remain restrained, at least for the time being. However, it does not mean that all risks are gone. The international society, as well as the two countries, should continue to pay tremendous attention to crisis management to prevent a wider regional war.
So the threats still linger, but for now, various analyses are pouring in about this. Some reports say that Israel abandoned plans for a much more extensive counterstrike on Iran amid pressure from the U.S. and other allies, while some focus on how the strikes were intended to signal that Israel has the ability to strike inside Iran. But all in all, the Middle East averted an all-out war, at least for now, as the two countries exercised restraint. Now, taking a closer look at the airstrikes, Professor Pan, the apparent Israeli attack targeted Isfahan in central Iran, home to a number of important military facilities, including nuclear facilities, a major airbase and factories associated with Iranian drone and other military production. How do you see this, and why is Israel not acknowledging its responsibility?
Well, I would say that Israeli attacks were strategically calculated simply beyond the tactical effectiveness. Israeli attacks could be defined as assertive quantitatively in the sense that Israel targeted many objects, including nuclear sites and military facilities. But at the same time, these attacks could be taken as little assertive qualitatively in the sense that there were no reports of serious destruction of major targets in Iran. Meanwhile, the reason why Israel does not acknowledge its responsibility is similar to the reason why Iran tries to underplay Israeli attacks by saying those attacks were like children's toy. To be more precise, the reason why Israel is reluctant to emphasize its counterattacks against Iran is that it wanted to make this attack a gray zone conflict at the moment, not a full-scale war. If Israel acknowledges its responsibility and announces its huge military success openly, Iran's harsh counterattacks will be inevitable. By not acknowledging its responsibility, Israel attempts to provide Iran with an exit strategy so that Iran will need no more military response. This type of ambiguous measure can be explained in two ways. First, as I mentioned earlier, this measure is related to the gray zone tactics. The gray zone mechanism is based on making the perpetrator's intentions look ambiguous so that the targeted state is not able to respond quickly. Likewise, the gray zone dynamics made an attacker hard to recognize. By doing so, a quick and fast response is not going to be made. Second, this measure is made to maximize the advantages of the NCND, neither confirm nor deny mechanism. Israel neither acknowledges its responsibility nor denies what it did not. By doing so, Israel seemed to kill two birds with one stone. First, a counter response, and second, the prevention of a wider regional war. A counter response is designed to punish Iran for its military attacks on Israel's homeland. Furthermore, its effort to prevent a wider regional war is designed to pay more attention to Israel-Hamas war and show the international society that is trying to its best to remain restrained. All in all, Israel's reluctance to acknowledge its responsibility is highly calculated to achieve both operational response and strategic expected utilities.
Killing two birds with one stone, well, so far it seems to have worked. Now, Jessica, according to various reports, Israel notified the U.S. prior to its attack on Iran. What do we know so far about this, and what is Washington's official stance on the apparent Israeli airstrikes?
Well, at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Italy, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked about this, and he refused to confirm that there was any advance notice. But there have been certainly some off-the-record affirmations of that from White House officials. Blinken also said that the U.S. is not involved in offensive operations. Meantime, the White House has not released a statement reacting to this attack at all. All we got was this. From Biden's statement on the new U.S. sanctions that the U.S. levied against Iran. He said, quote, "Let it be clear to all those who enable or support Iran's attacks. The United States is committed to Israel's security. We are committed to the security of our personnel and our partners in the region."
So not much is being said about that by the U.S. Now, staying with you, Jessica, the U.S. House of Representatives on Saturday passed billions of dollars in new military aid to Israel. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, this broke a real logjam that had been building for several months now. There were proposals on both sides of Congress essentially to fund a bunch of foreign military and aid initiatives, Ukraine, Taiwan, other Indo-Pacific contingencies, and of course, Israel and Gaza. So that was broken on Saturday night when you see there the House of Representatives passing $35 billion in aid to Israel and to Gaza. $17 billion of that is military aid to Israel. About $9 billion is in humanitarian aid to Gaza and other war-torn nations. Some estimates indicate that about $2 billion would go directly to Gaza, but not through UNRWA, which of course has historically been the distributor of aid to the Palestinian people. That is the United Nations arm for that particular type of aid. And the Biden administration has cut off any direct federal or U.S. government funding to that agency, arguing that members of it did participate in the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. Meantime, Israel is still asking for more aid to its military. It's just asked for about $1 billion in tank ammunition, tactical vehicles, and some in Congress are now pushing for that to be tied to humanitarian aid in Gaza. And we know that that conversation did take place most recently within the last 24 hours between the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and Israel's Minister of Defense, just concerning continued U.S. support for Israel, but also conversations around how to get more of that humanitarian aid to the Gazan people.
Well, the long-awaited legislation will now go to the Senate for a vote, which is expected to clear it on Tuesday. But it passed not without criticisms from within Washington over the unconditional military aid that could further escalate the already horrific humanitarian situation in Gaza, right? Meanwhile, Professor Pan, the U.S. and the U.K. imposed a new round of sanctions on Iran, aiming to hold Iran accountable for its first ever direct attack on Israel. Among the sanctions include individuals and entities linked to drones used in the attack. In your view, did the sanctions play a role in persuading Israel to scale down its retaliation?
To be honest with you, it is highly possible. I believe that the sanctions on Iran were imposed as part of the trade-off between Israel and the Western League led by the United States. If then, what did Israel achieve and what did it give way to? Under this trade-off, Israel attempted to scale down its retaliation as opposed to its harsh retaliations against Hamas. And in doing so, it had to show a lack of assertiveness in a sense. In return for this advantage, Israel was able to encourage the United States and the UK to strongly support itself militarily as well as diplomatically. A new round of sanctions on Iran related to these attacks on Israel serve as a strong signal that they are siding with Israel. Likewise, I would say that the U.S. military aid package to Israel was possible partly under this trade-off. What did U.S. achieve and what did it lose gaining ground? Well, through this trade-off, the United States showed the international society that its leadership is still working by making Israel remain restrained, and it can afford to make crisis management functional in the Middle East. Since the U.S. has already imposed sanctions on Iran for quite a long time, a new round of sanctions on Iran is not a great policy change. In this vein, the United States achieved this diplomatic objective without taking a big risk. In the meantime, U.S. has something to lose as well. Some pundits could ask why the United States imposed the sanctions only Iran, not Israel, which attacked the consulate building of Iran located in Syria. This lack of consistency might be disadvantageous for the United States to preserve a rules-based international order. I'm not sure whether this type of trade-off will continue to go on in the future, how long this restraint will be maintained. However, I would say that this trade-off obviously helped Israel scale down its retaliation and the United States prevent a wider regional war in the Middle East.
Jessica, it's been a hectic week for the U.S. as well as yourself, right? With the country's plate being overloaded with a myriad of serious diplomatic tasks. The U.S. also vetoed Palestine's request for full UN membership, once again supporting its ally Israel. What motives might lie beneath this decision?
Well, the deputy ambassador to the UN really spelled it out very directly when he said the United States continues to support a two-state solution. This vote does not reflect opposition to Palestinian statehood, but instead is an acknowledgement that it will only come from direct negotiations between the parties. So essentially, the U.S. has taken the position that it does not want to support Palestinian statehood through the United Nations process, recognizing it as an independent state, even though it already has observer status. It has had that since 2012, which is a de facto state recognition. But it does not, the U.S. takes the position that it doesn't want to recognize the Palestinian people in that way through the United Nations, but rather through the negotiated settlement of a two-state solution. Hamas reacted strongly, of course, calling on the international community to support the struggle of the Palestinian people and their, quote, legitimate right to determine their destiny. And the UN Secretary General said basically failure to make progress on the two-state solution only increases the volatility of the region. But of course, there is a large gap and a largening gap between these two entities, essentially, now that they are in the middle of what appears to be a widening war between the two parties.
Now, shifting gears to U.S. China tensions, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit China this week. Jessica, what's expected from his trip?
Yeah, he's going to be there for 2 days, April 24th through 26th, and he's expected to meet with several senior officials in both Shanghai and Beijing. Key issues are really the gamut of issues that come up between these two countries when they do have face-to-face talks. Chinese firms supplying the Russian military, artificial intelligence, military-to-military communications, and a senior State Department official said on Friday that the US government essentially has no large expectations of major outcomes or breakthroughs on any of these issues. But there is this continuing drumbeat of the issue of military support by China, or at least state-owned enterprises in China supporting the Russian military effort because they are accused of selling dual-use technology to the Russians, particularly drones, cruise missile technology, and weapons ingredients. And this is under consideration by the G7 and the US government for additional sanctions on those entities, in particular Chinese banks that are financing these already sanctioned Chinese people. And they've already sanctioned, I should say, Chinese people and Chinese companies for supporting Russia. Right now, Washington is trying to get the European Union to do the same thing, but Beijing calls all of this, quote, a smear on its reputation.
President Biden said he will push to triple the current 7.5% China tariff rate on steel and aluminum imports. His call comes as the U.S. ups pressure on China to amend its trade practices. Now, Dr. Ban, Jessica just mentioned that no major breakthrough is expected, but would the two countries be able to at least mitigate the trade frictions to a certain degree during Blinken's visit?
Well, to be honest, I don't think Blinken's visit can help mitigate the trade friction between the United States and China because it's not simply diplomacy, but is related to international politics of the United States. Through the announcement by its homepage, the U.S. Department of State mentioned that the U.S. and China are expected to deal with a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues, including the crisis in the Middle East, Russia's war against Ukraine, cross-trade issues, and the South China Sea. The trade issue was not on the list. What does that mean? As you are well aware, there is a presidential election on 5 November 2024 in the United States. The rematch between Biden and Trump will be highly expected if this political setup continues to go on. How to deal with an unfair situation of trade with China is important to seize the initiative of this political competition in the United States. In particular, Trump mentioned that he would consider imposing tariffs of 60% or higher on Chinese goods. And this assertive policy is helping him gain more support from the domestic audience. So President Biden might be seen as a little assertive in dealing with the trade unfairness with China if he does not take any action, leading him to lose political ground in American politics. So President Biden is politically under pressure to increase the tariff rate on China. To put it another way, the reason why he ordered to increase it from 7.5% to 25% on Chinese steel and aluminum imports intended to offset Trump's assertive policy against China. In short, the underlying logic between this tariff increase is closely related to domestic politics. In this respect, again, this decision is not a matter of diplomacy, but a matter of winning the Oval Office. So Blinken's visit would make it hard to resolve this issue. Beijing is also fully aware of this underlying background that President Biden ordered to triple the China tariff. So although Beijing must be unpleased with this decision made by Washington, China is most likely to deal with this trade battle more strategically rather than one by one or directly grapple with the decision itself to triple the tariff on China's steel and aluminum imports.
All right, we're a little pressed on time, so just very quickly before we let you go, Jessica, a recent U.S. House report has become another source of conflict between Washington and Beijing. It says that the Chinese government is complicit in the U.S. fentanyl epidemic, subsidizing the manufacturing of fentanyl materials. What have you learned so far about this, and why is this issue emerging as the hot potato?
Well, fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 to 49. And there are two main areas in every American's daily life that are impacted by U.S. China relations, that issue and trade. So the U.S. government is actually, this congressional report, I should say, points out that if the Chinese government was serious about addressing this, which has come up repeatedly in U.S. China relations, they would stop the subsidies and rebates they are providing to their chemical companies for exporting the chemicals that make fentanyl. This is what the report shows as evidence that they are not serious about stopping it. And those subsidies only go to companies who export, not create them for domestic consumption, because of course fentanyl is illegal in China. A spokesperson at the Chinese embassy says they are sincere in their efforts, but again, this is a critical issue in U.S. politics, also a critical issue in the U.S.-China relationship.
All right, we'll leave it there tonight, but we'll continue to closely watch Blinken's trip as well as further developments on the fentanyl feud as well, and also the tensions in the Middle East, of course. Thank you, Jessica and Professor Pan, for your perspectives. We
Pleasure.
appreciate your contribution to the discussion.
Thanks for having me.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.